Link TV, connecting you to the world. Link TV is viewer supported. Watch more at linktv.org.
Link TV presents Mosaic World News from the Middle East. Here are today's top stories.
Amnesty International slams Bahrain and Saudi Arabia for gross human rights abuses against women. Yemeni tribesmen shoot down military plane. And European powers drop call for UN sanctions against Syria. Mosaic, world news from the Middle East, begins now.
Amnesty International called on Bahraini authorities to urgently investigate reports that women and girls were tortured in detention after being arrested during pro-reform protests. The organization said 38 women and 7 girls were arrested at a shopping mall in central Manama. Many of them are suffering from poor health conditions.
Under these slogans, a massive number of protesters kicked off a rally condemning the Bahraini regime for violating the honor of women in the custody of the Saudi-backed forces. In the town of Karbabad, protesters slammed the regime's violation of the detained women's honor as a line that cannot be crossed and called for their immediate release. In the village of Nabi Saleh, women and men chanted slogans to mark a week of protests dubbed "Anything But Honor." The protesters voiced their rejection to the regime's policy of crackdowns and vowed to achieve the objectives that sparked the Bahraini Intifada, or uprising. In the town of Sitra, protesters called for the downfall of the regime and for the establishment of a republican rule. From Sitra to the village of Barbar, protesters raised the Bahraini flag and demanded the departure of the regime. In conjunction, Saudi and Bahraini security forces fired tear gas and live ammunition in an attempt to disperse the peaceful protests. The situation was not much different in the area of Dir, where the heavily armed Saudi-backed Bahraini forces confronted peaceful demonstrators with gunfire. Meanwhile, Amnesty International called on Bahraini authorities to urgently investigate reports that women and girls were tortured in detention after being arrested in Manama during pro-reform protests. The organization said that 38 women and 7 girls were apprehended at a shopping mall in central Manama. The women were detained without arrest warrants, interrogated without a lawyer present, prevented from praying and contacting family members, and were denied access to food. The organization added that several of them are in poor health and require medical treatment. Amnesty International Deputy Director Philip Luther said the Bahraini authorities have patently denied these women and girls their rights and demanded that Manama allow them access to legal counsel and also allow them to contact their families.
In another development, Amnesty International condemned a flogging sentence issued by a Saudi court against a woman for defying the driving ban in the kingdom. The organization slammed the ruling as a cruel punishment against women for exercising a legitimate right. Amnesty International expressed doubt about the announcement issued this week by King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz, who reaffirmed women's right to vote and run in local elections starting in 2013.
We refuse to marginalize women in roles that comply with Sharia or Islamic law.
This was the announcement of Saudi King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz before the Shura Council in the kingdom. Nearly 48 hours following the announcement, a Saudi court issued a flogging sentence against a woman, not because she committed an immoral or sinful act, but for simply driving a car in defiance of the ban imposed on women in the kingdom. The ruling is the cruelest yet in the recent crackdown on women who are defying the driving ban. This means that the reforms announced by the king are nothing more than an attempt by the kingdom to turn a blind eye on the events unfolding in the kingdom. This is not the first time a woman has defied the driving ban. In previous incidents, several women were dragged to police headquarters and forced to appear in court. In most cases, the authorities detained the women for days, seized their cars, and had them sign a statement promising not to drive again. Amnesty International expressed anger and condemned the most recent sentence, adding that the court's decision undermines the reforms announced by King Abdullah last Sunday. The organization described the decision as a cruel punishment against women for exercising a legitimate right, and added that the king's reforms amount to very little. 2 other women are expected to face similar charges in connection with the driving ban imposed in the kingdom.
Our Al Jazeera correspondent said gunmen shot down a warplane northeast of Sana'a. The Yemeni defense minister confirmed the news, saying that a Sukhoi Su-22 fighter jet was shot down.
Meanwhile, massive demonstrations continue in a number of Yemeni cities, affirming their commitment to the revolution and demanding the international community meet their demands.
Yemeni President Ali Abdullah Saleh called on the Yemeni Society of Religious Scholars to issue an Islamic ruling regarding those he described as rejecters of dialogue and peace and violators of constitutional law, in reference to the people and members of the military revolting against his regime.
Ahmed Ali Saleh, the enemies of the youth.
She has become known as Khansa of Yemen. Her screams reaffirm the revolutionaries' commitment to their demand for the downfall of the regime. It seems as though the blood of her son and the hundreds of killed and wounded has revived the spirit of the Yemeni movement among the people, as well as militarily and politically. Several provinces in revolt raised the demand of executing the perpetrators of the September 18th and 19th massacres. But since then, the situation has changed. The wounded president returned to his country with vengeance, as his opponents say. The fighting intensified in Taiz and Arhab, where tribesmen became prominent in clashes. While marking the anniversary of the September 26th revolution against the rule of Imamat in the 1960s, the Yemeni people are at the center of the revolution for change. The international community is finally taking action, but far from the Yemeni public's heart and soul. On the ground, tribesmen shot down a Sukhoi Su-22 fighter jet in Adarij village, northeast of Sana'a, after it bombed the 2 regions of Nahim and Ahab. In Taiz, strong explosions echoed at night in areas north of the city, and clashes were renewed between Saleh's forces and armed supporters of the revolution. Despite the clashes, the revolutionary scene in Taiz remains the strongest. Taiz and Sana'a are carrying the longest petition with colorful signatures to get international humanitarian societies to pay attention.
Blue is for peace and the red represents the blood of the martyrs.
However, the international community does not seem to see the Yemeni issue other than through its armed conflicts. The world is content with the Saudi-brokered Gulf Initiative, which the revolutionaries reject. At the United Nations, the Yemeni foreign minister downplayed the events in his country as no more than crises conjured by the opposition that failed in the elections.
The political opposition, which has been a partner to the ruling regime since the establishment of the unified state in May 1990, has decided to exit from the negotiations.
Kirby says that the opposition is walking out on its ruler for political reasons. Meanwhile, President Saleh hints that the opposition, backed by the youth, is committing the sin of deviating from the religious ruling. Saleh is demanding the Yemeni Society of Religious Scholars loyal to him issue an Islamic law on the matter. Political observers fear that Saleh may use religion as a method to legitimize the bloodshed after the constitution justified his holding onto power. In his speeches, the Yemeni president warns of terrorism and al-Qaeda, using the excuse of what's happening north of Sana'a to raise banners of vowing to cleanse the country of al-Qaeda, just as the tribes in Abyan did before. Saleh also warns of secession, which has prompted the revolutionaries in Aden to take to the streets, not only calling for the complete unity of Yemen, but of all Arab nations in revolt. They're carrying Libyan flags and also expressing concern for Syria. Saleh warns of a looming civil war, and the revolutionaries of Dammar insist that it's... The people want a civil state, but the 8 months of struggle show how lonely the Yemeni people have been in the revolution, especially as the revolutionaries complain about their ruler clinging to power, the weakness of their supporters, and the negligence and conspiracy of foreign powers.
The latest reports from Syria indicate the Syrian army continues to carry out military operations for a second consecutive day in the city of Rastan. While protests continued in a number of Syrian cities, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights announced that a nuclear engineer was assassinated by unknown attackers in Homs. In this context, the UN Security Council is discussing the draft resolution condemning what it referred to as the Syrian regime's practices. However, the draft resolution does not include any call for imposing sanctions on Damascus.
The draft resolution circulating in the UN Security Council, submitted by Britain, France, Germany, and Portugal, stopped short of imposing sanctions on the Syrian government amid threats by Russia and China to veto any proposed immediate sanctions. This is the first time the Security Council has spoken of sanctions against Damascus. Prior to this, it only issued a statement on the repression of the peaceful protests, which has led to 2,700 fatalities, according to the UN. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who accused Assad of failing to deliver on his promises of reform, called for putting an end to the bloody crackdown on protests in a meeting with Syrian Foreign Minister Walid Muallim. In a speech at the UN General Assembly, Muallim accused the West of attempting to, quote, divide Syria by inciting overwhelming chaos in its territories. The draft resolution coincided with a press conference in Washington by what is called the Syrian Revolution General Commission, a body representing 10 opposition parties. At the press conference, the commission announced its support of imposing a no-fly zone to protect civilians in Syria, imposing an arms embargo, and freezing the assets of Syrian officials. On the ground, night protests continued in various regions. Protests also broke out this morning in a number of areas demanding the downfall of the regime and in solidarity with Rastan city, where the Syrian army and security institutions are conducting a massive military operation and have set up military checkpoints throughout the city. According to activists, ferocious battles took place in western Rastan between the army and groups of defected soldiers backed by armed civilian groups. It seems as though peacefully protesting is no longer the only method for the protesters, activists assert. After a number of soldiers defected from the army and uploaded videos onto YouTube, several confrontations turned into armed battles. In another development, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said unknown attackers assassinated a Syrian nuclear engineer named Aus Abdul Karim Khalil in Homs on Wednesday morning. The observatory said Khalil is the fourth Syrian academic and scientific figure assassinated by unknown people in Homs in the last 3 days. As activists on the ground are accusing Syrian authorities of murdering him, the Syrian regime is accusing Western countries of inciting chaos in the country. Hayan Yaqub, BBC.
Libya's new rulers said today they believed fugitive ex-leader Muammar Gaddafi was behind being shielded by nomadic tribesmen in the desert near the Algerian border town. While his followers fend off assaults on his hometown, Gaddafi could be holed up near the western town of Hadames under the protection of Tuareg tribesmen. Gaddafi's son Saif al-Islam was in Bani Walid and another son Mutassim was in Sirte, the family's hometown. Lack of coordination and divisions at the front have been hampering NTC attempts to capture Sirte and Bani Walid. Fighting continued on separate eastern and western fronts in Sirte today, and commanders said they were planning to try to join the two fronts together and take the city's airport. Street fighting was underway at around about 2 kilometers east of the town center, where anti-Gaddafi fighters were pinned down for a third day by sniper and artillery fire.
A U.S.-led foreign soldier has been killed in eastern Afghanistan. NATO says the service member was killed in a militant attack in Wardak province. The nationality of the trooper is unknown. Since the beginning of this year, violence across that country has taken the lives of more than 450 U.S.-led foreign troops, many of them American. Militancy wreaks havoc in the country despite the presence of 150,000 foreign forces there.
Reports out of Afghanistan say American troops have killed more than 10 Afghan civilians during an overnight attack. The attack took place in the district of Nangarhar province near the border with Pakistan. Witnesses say U.S. troops also arrested a number of Afghans during the attack. Local officials confirmed the operation and said it targeted anti-government militants. The U.S. military has yet to confirm the attack. The U.S.-led foreign forces have already come under Afghan government and public condemnation for civilian killings.
Residents of Pakistan's tribal areas near the Afghan border have held their first ever protest against the U.S. Washington has repeatedly attacked the region using drones, killing several hundred civilians, including women and children. Our correspondent Zaid Hussain has more.
People of Pakistan's federally administered tribal areas bordering Afghanistan enjoyed their first ever granted political right when they held a rally demanding peace and stability in their region.
We demand of our Pakistan army to stop fighting against its own people and instead promote peace, love and harmony among the tribal people. Our tribal people are die-hard Pakistanis and they love the country.
The rally, which was organized by the country's largest politico-religious party, Jamaat-e-Islami, was the first of its kind in federally administered tribal areas after 64 years of Pakistan's independence. The area is still governed by the British-framed archaic law of 1901 with an obsolete system of administration that does not allow human rights to come into full play. Besides, the US drone attacks and Pakistani military attacks against suspected militants in the region have caused havoc with the loss of many innocent lives.
The government has always neglected and deprived us of our rights. Besides, since many years we are left at the mercy of drone attacks and military operation. All these is playing havoc with our lives.
The rally in Khyber Tribal Agency was made possible after Pakistan's president signed 2 orders to extend the Political Parties Act and to introduce changes in the British legislated Frontier Crimes Regulation. In their first ever held political gathering, tribal people strongly opposed the US drone attacks and Pakistani military operations, which they believed are carried out at the behest of the United States. They demanded an end to the US drone attacks and the military offensives, as both they said have been deteriorating situation in tribal areas. The newly legislated reforms are seen as the first step towards legal and political development in Pakistan's tribal regions. However, political analysts believe that as long as pro-Taliban militants hold sway in the regions, the area will remain a human rights free zone to a larger extent. Zahid Hussain, Press TV, Khyber Agency.
Afghan lawmakers have urged the United Nations to force Pakistan to stop rocket attacks against Afghanistan. In an open letter to the Security Council, the lawmakers criticized the Pakistani cross-border attacks, calling for an immediate end to the situation. Kabul threatened to cut diplomatic ties with Islamabad if the shelling continues. Pakistan says the rocket strikes are in response to what it calls attacks against the territory from Afghanistan. Tensions between the two neighbors have heightened in recent weeks. Afghanistan blames elements with the Pakistani government for supporting Taliban militants, while Islamabad blames Kabul for giving refuge to militants on its side of the border.
Joining me now in the studio is the Prime Minister's spokesman, Mark Regev. Mark, thanks for coming in.
Always a pleasure.
Do we need to renegotiate the peace treaty with Egypt, or can we just give them temporary approval to send in extra troops?
You know, the peace treaty has been a foundation for regional security, for security and peace in the Middle East for more than 30 years. I think it serves Israel's interest, it serves the interests of Egypt, and we want to keep that treaty strong. It's clear there is a new problem today of terrorism, and we have to work effectively with the Egyptians in cooperation to make sure that this terrorism is under control, that we deal with terrorists firmly, don't allow them to turn the border area into a zone of terrorism, and Israel and Egypt have a common interest in succeeding in this effort.
If the Egyptian army and security forces, however, fail to really bring this terrorism under control, Israel faces a real dilemma.
Let's be clear here. We have a strong peace treaty with Egypt. We want to see it to continue, and we think the Egyptians have no interest whatsoever in seeing terrorism get the upper hand, just as the Jordanians don't and other neighbors. We have a common interest in not letting extremists being able to dictate the agenda to the states of the region.
Let's switch subjects to the UN General Assembly. Will resume its session, the 66th session, this coming in about 3 weeks' time. Eli Wagalanter talked about what might happen if the Palestinians go ahead and push through with their plan to declare a unilateral statehood. Looks like it's a foregone conclusion. They have more than 120 supporters in the UN. What is Israel prepared to do?
We're looking at a whole series of different options. But what we're making clear here is that the Palestinians, in doing so, are violating the spirit, if not the letter, of their obligations, of their signed agreements with Israel in the different treaties that have been signed and the different agreements. They committed themselves to solving all issues of contention with Israel at the negotiating table, that all issues of conflict would be solved through peaceful negotiations. And by bypassing the negotiations, in many ways we're seeing the Palestinian side abrogate their commitments. And you've seen very senior people in my government say that if the Palestinians feel free to abrogate their commitments, surely Israel should at least consider doing the same.
In the following program entitled In Search of Shibli al-Aissami, we look into the relationship between Syria's former vice president and the ruling regime in Damascus.
As al-Aissami's faith in the principle of unity grew strong, that belief became so strong it created a division. So he resorted to poetry to plead to his Lord. In Iraq, there's one Baath Party, and in Syria, there's another. However, neither Baath Party resembled in any way the founding Baath Party that was envisioned by a man in his 70s. In 1992, the two Baath parties completed their transformation from Arab socialist parties to one-family dynasties led by a single leader without any partners. And al-Aissami felt alienated from both.
I remember when they made us sign the document to reduce benefits, which would go to the leadership. His name was the first one because he was the earliest member of the party. His name was at the top of the list and had the largest number of benefits. He always respected everyone.
After al-Aissami's work as an organizer ended, he could have ensured a return to his country and spent his old age in Swaida, his birthplace. However, his return was not a personal choice. The choice was in the hands of his former comrade, Hafez al-Assad. The old Baath Party member was not welcomed in Damascus since the start of the corrective movement.
استلم عدة وزارات بسوريا ما بين 63 ل 66.
Between 1963 and 1966, he led a number of ministries in Syria, including the ministries of Education, Culture, Agriculture, and National Guidance.
وسنة ال 66 وصل.
In 1966, he was appointed as Vice President of the Republic under President Amin al-Hafiz.
الرئيس أمين الحافظ.
بالنص الثاني من 66.
In the second half of 1966, he became involved in a movement organized by the military with the aim of orchestrating a coup. There was a national command controlled by the military and a national leadership that included Mr. Shibli, Mr. Michel, the Secretary General, the founder, and Mr. Salah al-Bitar. So the military command overthrew the national leadership. Salah Jadid was one of them, and so were Salim Haroum and a group of officers. Mr. Shibli managed to leave after that arrest. He fled Syria in 1966 and came here to Lebanon.
So, al-Aissami stayed in Iraq until the downfall of the regime, and with its downfall, he was given the chance to return to Syria, but rejected the offer.
Toward the end of his time here, he was offered the chance to return. Of course, it didn't happen like the newspapers said, that the Syrian ambassador called him. This never happened, but some mutual friends with Syria initiated his return. He was offered the chance to go back to Syria, but he did not accept the offer.
Since becoming a member of a party is different than leaving it, at least in the Arab world, Shibli al-Aissami's affiliation with the Baath Party haunted him even 20 years after retiring from politics. The ideas he cultivated at a very young age and developed over the years eventually blossomed into unity, liberty, and socialism, and were harvested in his old age. What a bitter harvest. The views expressed on Mosaic are from contributing broadcasters, not Link TV or its sponsors. The production of Mosaic is made possible by grants from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Wincoat Foundation, the Firedoll Foundation, and by support of viewers like you. Thank you. Watch Mosaic World News online. Stay up to date with breaking news, read our blog, get transcripts of past shows, and more at linktv.org/mosaic.
This program is brought to you by Link TV for educational and non-commercial use only. Link TV is the only U.S. network dedicated to global and national news, uncompromising documentaries, and diverse cultural programs. Programs which connect you to the world.